counsel Robert Mueller and his team now have their hands on Russia-linked ads that ran on Facebook during the 2016 election. Now, a bipartisan group of senators wants to dig even deeper. One of those is Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York. She is part of that effort, and she joins us now. Great to have you here in studio.
It's a pleasure.
So, what a travesty of what we're learning about with Facebook and these Russian troll farms that somehow were able to advertise on Facebook, and nobody was any the wiser, thinking that they were reading real retweets from real Americans and real information from Americans. But it wasn't, and it was all, I mean, if what has leaked out is to be believed, you know, Russian troll farms behind it. What are you going to do about this?
So Senator Lindsey Graham and I have a bipartisan bill to do a deep dive, a 9/11 style commission that will look into how were we hacked, what were our cyber vulnerabilities, what are our cyber vulnerabilities today, and what can we do to prevent another type of interference in the 2018 election.
And what do you want Facebook and social media to do? I mean, if they're
they're not above the law, and it is illegal for foreign countries to undermine or participate in our elections. So buying those Facebook ads is illegal. So what we need is more disclosure and more accountability, more transparency. But they have a role to play, and we need to have much better accountability by the next election.
So you've not been impressed with their transparency thus far?
It's not adequate, because they are responsible for people who buy their sites, who use their platform, and if they're breaking the law, there has to be some level of participation. So we are going to make sure that this deep dive reveals any vulnerabilities we have. We also have questions about were voting machines somehow interfered with.
Do you think they were? Because we've not seen evidence of that.
I've just heard some reports that there might have been efforts to decommission or somehow undermine different voting machines in different states, causing lines, causing people to not vote, particular states being targeted. So these are things that we need a full investigation of to see if there's any evidence of it, and then what evidence there is, and what can we do to protect ourselves next time.
Let's talk about another bit of bipartisanship that you're involved in, and that is you want to protect transgender military service members, particularly after what the president has just said in terms of a ban. So what are you going to do about that?
Well, these are men and women who are serving our country today, putting themselves in harm's way, risking their lives. No one should tell them they cannot serve based on their gender identity. And so I have a bipartisan bill with Senator McCain, Jack Reed ranking on the Dem side, along with Susan Collins, and Susan and I worked together to write the bill to say if you are serving today, you are protected, you cannot be kicked out, and that you may re-enlist.
And what about future people who want to enlist?
So that's the question, and that's what Secretary Mattis is doing right now, is analyzing what he intends to do in the future. But while that's happening, we want to make sure no one can be kicked out, because again, this goes to our basic civil rights and civil liberties. If someone is willing to die for this country, you should not tell them they can't serve.
Another topic that I want to talk to you about, because you and I have both worked on this in the past, and that's campus sexual assault. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos has said publicly that she wants to kind of revisit the guidance from the Obama administration in terms of how universities should handle this widespread problem of campus sexual assault. And it sounded as though what she wanted to look at was how to better protect. One of the things that she wanted to look at was how to make the system work better, she says, and to protect the falsely accused. What do you think of that?
Well, I have a concern that she doesn't understand the dynamics of these cases very well. I don't want an innocent person getting in trouble or being accused any more than I want a guilty person going free. And so we want to have a system. So we have a bipartisan bill right now in the Senate, and if she really wants to fix the problem, she should support our bill. It's widely supported by Democrats and Republicans, and the most important part of our bill is to have an online survey that students get to fill out every 2 years to say, number one, is my campus safe? What's the climate like? Have I been assaulted? If so, have I reported? If not, why not? You will get a snapshot in time for every college campus in America to say, what's the campus like? If they report on these surveys, there was 35 assaults last year and not one has actually been reported, you know you have a problem with your reporting structure or people's confidence in the system you have. And our bill really creates protections both for the accused and the accuser. We want to make sure that every school is well trained to basically have a certification process to say you know what you're doing when you're doing and reviewing these cases. And then another point that law enforcement's developed is having one confidential advisor on every campus. So if you are a victim of sexual assault, you have someone to go to, and she or he can tell you, this is what it looks like if you report on campus. You can only receive accommodation. You can get your class schedule changed, you can get your dorm changed, but it's only accommodation, and best case scenario, your assailant is kicked out. If you go to criminal justice, that means jail time, that means going through a trial. And I'll tell you, when you tell a survivor, if this happens again to someone else or a third person, will you be willing to testify? Typically, she says yes. And then the advisor can say, well, then you should get your rape kit done today. Because if you want to preserve your ability to testify in the future, that has to be done. It's a reason to do those kinds of things that, you know, a 18-year-old girl on a college campus might not want to do otherwise. So that's the key, getting more cases to ultimately go to law enforcement, but giving guidance to that individual on the first day about what are your options. That usually results in more cases ultimately going to law enforcement.
Okay, next topic. There seems to be a lot of analysis about the 2016 election going on all sides still, though it's in our rearview mirror. But Hillary Clinton, as you know, has her new book out. So she's been talking a lot about what she thinks, what she blames for her loss. She was just on PBS this weekend, and she was asked about that famous, infamous now tarmac meeting between then Attorney General Loretta Lynch and Bill Clinton. So let me play for you whether or not Hillary Clinton thinks that that was to some degree responsible for her loss. Listen to this.
To what extent did Loretta Lynch and President Clinton make a costly mistake?
Judy, I just don't buy that. I honestly reject that premise, partly because there's a chain of command in the Justice Department. The optics, you know, were not good. I admit that. What really was costly, and what I believe was the proximate cause of my defeat, was his October 28th letter.
Of course, she's talking about James Comey there. Do you think that in terms of that tarmac meeting, it was just bad optics?
So my view of this is we're looking forward to the 2018 elections, and I'm grateful that Secretary Clinton ran for president. I'm grateful that she's written her book because it's important for women to be heard in all places and to be able to tell their story. But fundamentally for me, that election is about how she inspired millions of people across the globe to stand up for what they believe in, to fight your hardest, win or lose. And as a result, we have thousands of women running for office this cycle. Emily's List reported that there were typically 1,000 or 2,000 women wanting to be trained and run at this time in the cycle. We have 14,000. And so I'm grateful for what Secretary Clinton has done, and I think she's inspired millions. And so I'm focused on how can we win these seats in 2018, and how can we encourage more candidates to come forward to run and to provide that oversight and accountability over President Trump.
Who's the leader of the Democratic Party right now?
I think you have your congressional leaders, of course, but I think, you know, Senator Sanders is out there talking about things that has big ideas like Medicare for all. I think Elizabeth Warren's out there talking about a rigged system that we desperately need to fix for working families. And for each of us who are running for re-election, such as myself and 24 other Senate Democrats, we're in our states talking about our vision and what we want to change and how we want to make a difference and how we want to make the economy grow.
But are they the national leaders, as you see it, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren?
I think that's how they're perceived, and I think they're doing a great job in terms of speaking out on the issues that matter to most people. But you won't really have a national leader Democrat until you have a nominee. So between now and then, you're really focused on state by state, winning over voters, listening to voters, hearing why they were so distressed in the last election, why many of them chose to vote for a disruptor, someone who's going to blow up the system, as opposed to someone who might have spoke to their values and goals better. And so we have to listen a lot harder, and then we have to work a lot harder in getting things done, actually passing legislation like things that will help people, rewarding work in this country, having paid leave in this country, having a minimum wage that's a living wage, things that could actually help people's lives, and we have to get that done.
What are your thoughts personally on 2020?
I think there's going to be a huge interest in trying to bring our country in a different direction. I think some of the policies that have come under the Trump administration have been really harmful, whether it's attacking DACA kids, whether it's attacking transgender troops, whether it's not investing in infrastructure, not investing in the middle class.
Right, but these are all issues that you care about. Are you thinking about running in 2020?
I'm focused on 18, so I'm focused on my re-election. I'd like to be a senator.
But at some point, I mean, is that in your future?
Well, I'm focused on being a senator, so that's all I'm doing right now. And I think
If there were a void or a vacuum in 2020 and nobody had emerged, would you throw your hat
you
in?
can ask me that question then, and I promise to answer it.
It'll be too late in 2020. I mean, look, are you comfortable with it being Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, or do you think that there's room for perhaps somebody who, I mean, they're seen as being quite on the left?
I think there's so much room. I mean, I think there's many people who plan to run. Certainly the pundits have talked about a list of at least 20 people who are thinking about running. So I'm certain we will have a whole array of fantastic candidates with different experience, some Senate experience, some gubernatorial, some private sector, and they'll all be sharing their vision for what they want for this country. And I think that will be a vibrant process and an exciting process, and I look forward to it. But in the meantime, we have to, I think all of us, focus on the importance of 2018 because we need to flip the House. We need to create a bulwark against some of President Trump's policies that are so harmful to the economy, so harmful to middle-class families. And that's what we have to do for me as a senator who's running for re-election, but also for anyone interested in politics to campaign for candidates that are trying to change the direction of this country.
Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, thanks so much for being here for such a comprehensive conversation.
You're welcome. My
pleasure. Great to
pleasure.
have you here in
Thank you.
studio. John.
I'm focused on 2018, Allison. It's going to be my answer tonight when my wife asked me to do something I don't want to do. All right, American students targeted in France, attacked with acid. Investigators say it's not a case of terrorism. Why not? The latest next.
These guys on your left and right, they will always be there, no matter what.
Special Counsel Robert Mueller's team now in possession from information from Facebook that could be linked to Russia, and it all has to do with the presidential election. The Special Counsel's office obtained a search warrant for the information. That is a huge deal. It could signal a significant turn in the investigation. Let's bring back our political panel, John Avalon, David Drucker, A.B. Stoddard. Look, the Special Counsel, in order to get this warrant, had to go to a judge and say, hey, we have evidence of criminal wrongdoing here. We need this information you have. Facebook says we won't turn over said information without a search warrant. This feels like a shift.
You can tell that Mueller is focusing in on these very specific things like obstruction of justice, the June 16th meeting, the obstruction of justice on firing of Comey, the crafting of a letter aboard an airplane home from Hamburg, Germany, with several associates and Trump about the June 16th, 2016 meeting. And he's focusing in on whether or not there was any collusion between a Trump associate helping Russian ad buyers on Facebook target certain places to reach certain voters. That would be the closest evidence of any kind of straightforward collusion we've come to see. And just as you said, a subpoena where he has to show cause, probable cause of a crime means that it's more than just a couple of Russian people buying some ads on Facebook.
And this is a question about when these Russian entities were buying these Facebook ads and deploying them potentially to millions of American people, and we know that they seem to have been promoting anti-immigration rallies. They seem to be very investigated. Was there any knowledge by anyone in the Trump orbit? It becomes a question, not only what did the Trump campaign know and when did they know it, but what did Facebook know and when did they know it? And the only time they're going to be willing to give this critical information is under a subpoena.
That's right, because Facebook has not been transparent about all of this stuff, David Drucker. They haven't wanted to tell the American people exactly what the extent of the Russian troll farms buying these ads and then proliferating them
Right.
around.
So I'm a little sympathetic to Facebook just because of the controversy of whether or not technology companies like this are going to share information provided to them by their customers, by their advertisers. As we know in Washington, with the National Security Agency's spying powers, there has been a huge debate over how much information the government should have access to unless it's part of a criminal case. What I would say about this that is super interesting is that there has always been two issues as a part of the 2016 campaign that we've been trying to figure out. One is the collusion issue. Was there collusion between Trump, his associates, and people working against Hillary Clinton, primarily the Russians? The other issue was, did the Russians meddle? A lot of people don't like the idea that the Russians meddled on behalf of Trump. It makes them uncomfortable.
Who likes that idea?
Well, if you're a Trump supporter, and I have had these discussions with Trump supporters, they don't think that the Russians would have wanted to help Trump. They would have wanted to help Clinton because that would signal that Trump maybe was not such a good guy.
That's a hermetically sealed universe.
Well, these, as you know, these tribal universes exist. But my point is, what this shows possibly is some real concrete evidence evidence of Russian meddling, which, if you follow this issue from the summer of 2015 on, would not surprise you in the least. Putin and his nationalist government always liked the idea of Trump. He was still mad at Hillary Clinton because he thought as Secretary of State, she intervened in his last election. And so
he would never say
but
anything
this
negative,
is something that people can get their hands around.
Two people concerned about this had a loud dinner at a Washington restaurant over the weekend. You know, Ty Cobb, who's the president's White House lawyer on this subject, and John Dad was there as well. And the New York Times overheard this conversation, which is astounding to me, two high-priced lawyers. And they were talking about whether or not the White House had a right to protect certain documents and how far they should go in turning over information there. But, AB, you know, what's your take on this story in the New York Times? Remarkable that these guys making a lot of money having a loud conversation for reporters to hear.
These were the ones who were brought in because the inside game was so weak that they needed other outside counsel
professionals.
To come in, graybeards to come in and sort of clean up this act. They're sitting there at a restaurant that we all know is literally steps from the New York Times bureau. It is paces. And talking about stuff about these internal fights over who is not trusting who to produce documents. And it's just an example of how much fighting and actually still leaking is going on. They weren't intentionally leaking there.
Or maybe they were. I mean, honestly,
can I just say how jealous I am, by the way? Because I daydream about scoops like this. I mean, all we do in Washington is hang out at, this is the closest you'll get to a Georgetown cocktail party, quote unquote, is a restaurant where a lot of us all hang out for one reason or another. And I always think, maybe I'll overhear something tonight. Never happens, and these guys got it.
It was a great scoop by Vogel, and he's sitting right there, and it's a sign of just how you know, competence should not be overestimated in people. But one of the lines that really jumps out is Ty Cobb of the Hall of Fame mustache saying that Don McGahn, White House counsel, has got documents in his safe that he won't turn over. That's significant. I mean, that's you know, so expect, you know, sign of coming attraction on that one.
Also the McGahn spy, which tells you that there's still a lack of trust inside where they feel like the different lawyers and different advisors are working against each other on this.
Okay, let's talk about what President Trump retweeted over the weekend. It was this doctored video of him hitting Hillary Clinton in the head or back with a golf ball and knocking her over. So, you know, John, I just don't even know. I mean, I'm sure the White House will say this is just a joke, just a joke. Yeah. But I mean, the interesting thing about jokes is that they're usually funny, and this is just weird and juvenile and everything else.
Are you saying it's not presidential, Alice?
I guess it is what I'm saying.
If Abraham Lincoln had Twitter, he would have done the same thing. No, I'm kidding. Obviously, the point is that, that Twitter Trump is the real Trump, and the president is attracted at the early morning hours to juvenile videos that often involve violence to his enemies. This may be a, hey, can't you get a sense of humor aspect? The fact that the account that had tweeted it out had a very typically unsavory history.
Oh, yeah. The name itself is disgusting from what he tweeted it out.
Yeah. So, you know, but this just shows that where the president's at. Is sort of high school bully level humor.
But it's also, you know, a former high school football player who cannot stop reliving his old glory, AB. It just seems like all he wants to talk about whenever he can is the fact that he beat Hillary Clinton in the election.
It's interesting because those two things. One, he had a tough week with the base last week, and he made, you know, plans with Chuck and Nancy, and he's worried about some blowback from that on Breitbart News. So he's trying to beat up on Hillary Clinton because his fans like that. But but behind the scenes, people will tell you that in White House discussions in private, he still brings up his victory against the Clinton machine as a reason for why he knows better than them on decision making when they're in just private small settings.
Yeah, and this has mileage because so much of his electoral base was motivated by the idea of Trump as their avatar, thumbing his nose at the system, just acting unpresidential for them is why they actually elected him. And so doing this every once in a while, as much as I think Trump is in so many ways a political id without any strategic forethought, I think when he does this sort of thing, he understands who's going to react to it and how they're going to react to it. And I think from his point of view, that works just fine for him. The interesting thing about the idea of who lacks a sense of humor is when this sort of thing is turned around on the president, there is no sense of humor whatsoever from him or his advisors in the White House.
Fair point. Panel, thank you very much.
All right, we got a lot of other news this morning. 2 hurricanes churning in the Atlantic, posing a threat to some already battered by Irma last week. We're going to have the latest forecast tracks. That's next.
The Emmy Awards last night had lots of memorable moments, but one in particular has everyone buzzing this morning.
What really matters to Donald Trump is ratings. Unfortunately, at this point, we have no way of knowing how big our audience is. I mean, is there anyone who could say how big the audience is? Sean, do you know?
This will be the largest audience to witness an Emmys, period, both in person and around the world.
Wow, that really soothes my...
All right, let's bring in CNN media analyst Bill Carter and CNN political analyst and New York Times deputy culture editor Patrick Healy. Great to have you guys. So, Patrick, was that like a tacit admission from Sean Spicer that when he said those very same words in the White House press briefing room that they were a lie or not true or a joke?
Yeah, I think Sean Spicer's been looking for a moment like this to show that he's ready and willing to sort of go there and to make fun of himself and to really, you know, sort of definitely create some space from President Trump. But it created a lot of discomfort. There were a lot of, a lot of Democrats, a lot of liberals in that audience watching home on TV who were not ready to go kind of the normalizing route. I think you just look at Melissa McCarthy's reaction during that moment. As she has said before, you know, my impression of Sean Spicer on SNL, it's not a joke between me and Sean Spicer. This is our joke. This is our critique of the Trump White House and politics. And it's not something that a lot of people are comfortable with.
First of all, I'm not sure it was a tacit admission. It felt like an explicit admission that perhaps Sean was saying things that weren't true when he said the crowd size was the biggest ever. But Bill, it was funny.
Well, that's it. I mean, you have to give comedians a comic moment. And then, you know, here's Stephen Colbert. He wants to be funny. This is a funny bit. Look at the audience reaction. They went wild when they saw this. And
It's
it was
a blurring
a comic
of lines
moment.
of our world. Yes, Stephen Colbert wants to be funny, but Sean Spicer's tasked with telling the truth. So how are we to analyze
Well,
this?
here's the thing. If you were, the people who criticized were mostly people saying he's a liar and he's a hypocrite, etc. But, you know, he was criticizing Trump as well. He was like saying this moment turns out to not have been particularly true, and he made things up the way he was making things up there. So he was mocking himself and he's mocking Trump. And I think that's partly what this show was about. With the show, it wasn't like there weren't shots at Trump all over the place.
Well, yeah.
All over that show. He was called Walter Whiter Than White. He was called a lying bigot by Lily Tomlin and Jane Fonda.
We have it.
You know,
Let's listen to some of these that took some shots at President Trump.
And your show has been, that thing you say about Trump being bad. It's so fresh, fresh.
Thank you. Back in 1980, in that movie, we refused to be controlled by a sexist, egotistical, lying, hypocritical bigot. Really?
And in 2017, we still refuse to be controlled by a sexist, egotistical, lying, hypocritical bigot.
I want to thank Trump for making black people #1 on the most oppressed list. He's the reason I'm probably up here.
We did have a whole storyline about an impeachment, but we abandoned that because we were worried that someone else might get to it first.
Yeah.
Poor Dolly Parton.
She did not look comfortable.
Right, because her audience, I mean,
Yes.
sure, you know, in
And
Dolly.
I have to say, if you're one of the people who Louis Dreyfus' line was pretty funny, I mean, that's a joke she was making.
Yeah, but look, these things always get political, right? I mean,
Right.
that's always fodder for
right.
the Emmys. But the Sean Spicer thing was definitely a new wrinkle. Adding a real person saying fake things for the punchline, all of that is where it gets muddy.
Right, and I mean, Stephen Colbert made a very deliberate choice. He wanted to have this moment. He thought that bringing Spicer out there, having Melissa McCarthy in the audience, would create some bang. But that's the thing. Last night, it's still, still 9 months into the Trump presidency. There's still, frankly, a lot of discomfort around this. Donald Trump is going to the UN this week. He's going to be talking about North Korea. He's going to be talking about the Iran nuclear deal. And there's still, giving a big wet kiss to Sean Spicer.
But Trump himself sends out a tweet calling the North Korean guy Rocket Man. Look, and he tries to be funny with a video of him hitting Hillary Clinton. So, are you going to laugh at this or are you going to laugh at that? I mean, at some point you have to sort of say, okay, you give people the space to try to be funny, and then you decide, did that make me laugh? Then it's funny.
I think it's the latest chapter in this dystopian novel that we're all living right now. Look, Handmaid's Tale won the Emmy, which just goes to show. But this idea that you have someone sort of blurring truth and the celebration of the blurring of truth is interesting, and it's a moment. And very quickly, is Sean Spicer going to have any problem getting a job? Yes or no?
I don't think so. I think
speeches.
He'll
make money. He'll do just fine.
And this probably helped him undoubtedly because he made fun of himself.
All right. If you were not watching the Emmys last night, or if you were watching the Emmys, you missed something truly wonderful on a different station. We're talking about award-winning documentarian Ken Burns, his powerful new series, 10 Years. Just weeks after Hurricane Irma devastated the Caribbean, 2 more hurricanes strengthening in the Atlantic.
Winds still at 90 miles per hour. No lack of action in the tropics whatsoever.
We're watching a storm system here. The threat very high.
This is New Day with Chris Cuomo and Allison Camerata.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to your new day. Chris is off this morning. John Berman joins me. Great to have you here.
Just in time for the UN.
There you go. It's a very big week and a big morning. So all eyes on President Trump at the United Nations as he prepares to address world leaders for the first time. The international community is watching to see how the president explains his America First policy and his skepticism of the UN.
North Korea's nuclear threat looming large over the meeting. U.S. officials warned Pyongyang that time is running out for a peaceful solution. U.S. bombers and fighter jets again today conducted drills over the Korean peninsula. Plus, we have the latest on 2 hurricanes posing a threat to the Northeast and the Caribbean. We have this all covered for you this morning. Let's begin with Michelle Kaczynski live at the United Nations. Michelle.
Hi, John. Spending some time with a couple of the foreign delegations over the last few days, what you hear is how curious they are, not only just about what Donald Trump will say, but how he will say it. What will his tone be? Will this be a fully scripted Trump or not so much? How much support will he express for the UN? How much will he articulate foreign policy beyond what they've already heard in the tweets, the America First, as well as multiple mixed messages from this administration? President Trump, now home in New York, but about to face the UN, a body he has sharply and repeatedly slammed.
The United Nations is not a friend of democracy. It's not a friend to freedom.
Where now he will also seek more cooperation to face the world's biggest problems. The president set the stage with a Sunday tweet storm, referring to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un as Rocket Man, and retweeting a video edited to show him knocking over former rival Hillary Clinton with a golf ball. Members of his administration out in front of cameras with more tough talk on the North Korean nuclear threat.
We don't have a lot of time left. If our diplomatic efforts fail, though, our military option will be the only one left.
Was the president's fire and fury remark an empty threat?
It was not an empty threat. I'm perfectly happy kicking this over to General Mattis because he has plenty of military options.
At the same time, though, the U.S. has been aggressively calling on China and Russia to do more to choke off Kim Jong-un's resources. Beijing and Moscow did vote in favor of unprecedented UN sanctions against North Korea, a step the president and his national security advisor have since downplayed, to the apparent chagrin of the State Department.
Are the sanctions a big deal, or are they not a big deal? Because I've heard 2 really different things.
I think the sanctions, and I'm not going to go against the president, but I think the sanctions are significant.
Allies have been confused at times over what this administration values more, collaboration or going it alone. Trump's America First doctrine reflected in the 3 themes the president is expected to touch on in his speech Tuesday.
First is to protect the American people. The second is to promote American prosperity. And the third is really to help promote accountability, and sovereignty.
The U.S. footprint at the UN this year, much smaller than it's been in the past. Meetings overall, fewer, leaving allies skeptical of how much the U.S. will be engaged on key agenda items like democracy promotion, refugees, and the environment, and how a nationalistic leader of the free world will embrace this global entity now.
I personally think he slaps the right people, he hugs the right people, and he comes out with U.S. being very strong in the end.
So among the mixed messages that we've heard that the world now is going to try to decipher here are, is the U.S. truly out of the Paris climate deal or not? Is the U.S. leaving the Iran nuclear deal? And let's take a look at the president's schedule. First, we'll hear him chairing a session on reforming the UN. He wants to make it more efficient. He'll meet with the Israeli prime minister, the French president, and then tonight, a dinner with Latin American leaders. John and Allison.
Okay, Michelle, thank you very much. We'll try to get those questions answered. Let's bring in our political panel. Joining us now is CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger and CNN political analyst David Gregory. Great to see both of you. David Sanger, what are we expecting this week at the UN, in particular, about the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, a few things, Allison. First, the president's only moving, 14 blocks away from Trump Tower. But in many ways, it's a world away. As you indicated there, this is not his favorite institution. If you've come to office arguing for America first, that is not the founding principle of the UN. So there's a built-in tension here. And the Iran deal is going to be one of the first big tests, because the president has made it pretty clear that he considers this not only a terrible deal, but one that the United States should find its way out of. Now, my reporting last week suggested that while he's going to talk a lot about finding his way out of it, he's not actually going to do something that violates it and leaves it. And that's because if he does, the Iranians would be free to go resume their production of uranium and plutonium and put themselves right back in the position of getting near a nuclear weapon at a moment that we've got another nuclear problem on the other side of the world. So he's got a lot of advisors, Rex Tillerson included, telling him, make a lot of noise about it if you want, decertify that the Iranians are complying, but don't actually leave the deal.
David Gregory, you've covered many presidents addressing the UN. Look, there are two audiences here. There's the audience at the United Nations, the General Assembly, leaders from all over the world who will be listening, and then there are the American people, particularly people who elected President Donald Trump. Which group do you think he'll be addressing this week?
Well, I think he'll be speaking to both, but I think there's probably different expectations. I think Americans are rightly very concerned about North Korea, how that's going to unfold, about the prospect of miscalculation, about who's really running North Korea policy, whether, the president on his tweets, is he impulsive? Is he taking a more measured approach and a more strategic approach with a foreign policy team? And then the international community that's wondering whether this very go-it-alone president, an America First president on trade, coming out of the climate change protocols of the Paris Accord, and somebody who talks really unhelpfully about terrorist attacks and in Great Britain. Is he someone who is really doesn't want to play well with others, doesn't want to negotiate, doesn't want to lead in the way that America has historically led? And so I think that's where North Korea kind of becomes the focal point for both of these audiences, to see how the president talks about it, how he approaches it, how he both asserts American authority and leadership and the prospect of American military action, and tries to rally China, South Korea, and others to play a really responsible role. So when McMaster talks about accountability on the part of other countries, I think that's where the president tries to call on other countries to do more of their share to diffuse this.
David, on the North Korea front, let's talk about a little bit more of your reporting. And that is the U.S. trying to figure out who is providing this very powerful rocket fuel to North Korea. It's called UDMH. Those are its initials. And the thinking is that China and Russia had been providing that to North Korea, and we don't know if they still are.
That's right, Allison. This is a story I did with my colleague, Bill Broad. And the reason we focused on it is that while the world is talking, and Nikki Haley was talking about trying to cut off fuel oil and all that to the North Koreans, which could prompt a pretty big humanitarian crisis in the winter if you're freezing out 25 million North Koreans. There is a simpler way at this, which is to try to cut off their access to this very rare fuel, which is what powers their ICBMs. Now, initially, they had to get this fuel from China and from Russia. Those were the only two significant producers who would likely sell it to them. The intelligence community, when we asked a number of questions about it, came back and said they now think that the North Koreans probably have the capability to produce it itself. But there is a significant failure here for the West, Allison, because we found intelligence reports, some of them in the WikiLeaks trove from 2010, that go back to the Bush administration, in which Condoleezza Rice is warning that the North Koreans with this fuel are going to be able to reach the United States soon with a long-range missile. And of course, 10 years later, that's exactly what's happened. And we couldn't find any significant national security officials, senior national security officials, who are able to tell us that they ever really focused on this during the Bush and Obama years. So it is a bit of a mystery how the North Koreans were able to get away with importing this very rare fuel.
You know, it's interesting, David Gregory, a lot of focus this morning on Rocket Man, you know, President Trump referring to the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un as a Rocket Man in this tweet you can see right here. But beyond that, you know, what are the deliverables this week you think the president wants on the North Korean issues? Is it clarity? Is it coherence? Is it maybe the pathway to more sanctions?
Well, there's no question that they've put some sanctions in place, and as David's suggesting, they want to cut off fuel oil, which is a dramatic step if it were to come to pass. But I think part of what they want here is to get to a stage of negotiation. I mean, if you're talking about Kim, you know, pursuing a path of his own national honor, his own self-preservation as a regime, there's no question he's being aided in that by China, to the extent that China also, as a rising military power challenging the United States, does not want further U.S. influence in their neighborhood by any kind of war with North Korea and the catastrophe that would come from all of that. But one result would be still a lot more American influence in North Korea, and perhaps a unified Korea. So that, I think, is where, presumably in meetings, the president wants to try to advance his influence and play his hand to get more pressure from the Chinese on the North to finally negotiate. I mean, that may be what it is, that they get to a point where there's some discussion of a nuclear freeze, and that the North gets to hold on to at least some of what it's got, despite what U.S. officials are saying that they don't want them to have nuclear weapons.
Look, that would be more than what the administration right now claims it would settle for, but interesting that it's even being discussed. David Gregory, David Sanger, thank you so very much. President Trump's longtime personal attorney, Michael Cohen, telling CNN he will appear tomorrow before the Senate Intelligence Committee. Cohen's appearance will be voluntary as part of the panel's investigation into Russia's election interference. Cohen had previously said he would decline invitations to testify from the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, but would comply with the subpoena, saying he has nothing to hide.
Senate Republicans making a last-ditch effort to repeal and replace Obamacare. This week, GOP leaders will gauge support for the new plan introduced by Senators Lindsey Graham and Bill Cassidy. If there is enough support, the proposal could come up for a vote next week. The bill calls for an end of the individual and employer mandates and would shift Medicaid expansion funding to the states. Democrats warn that millions could lose health care if the bill passes.
2 hurricanes churning in the Atlantic and posing a threat to the Northeast and to the Caribbean islands, still devastated by Irma last week. CNN meteorologist Chad Myers keeping an eye on both storms. Chad, 2 of them.
Yes. So let's go in alphabetical order. We'll start with Jose. Jose poses a danger for significant wave action and rip currents along the East Coast. That's its major concern right now, anywhere from Block Island all the way back down south, even at the Delmarva. The storm is still 70 miles per hour, almost 80 miles per hour at times, and it is still going to sit there and churn right over the Atlantic. And it's not going to move, and the waves are going to be 16 feet. Waves like you have not seen on the East Coast in a long time. Now to Maria, a storm that will be a Category 4 as it approaches the U.S. Virgin Islands and also Puerto Rico. This is a big storm for this area because it's already been hit. The homes are already damaged and things are going to fly around 130 to 140 miles per hour. Now let me take you and push this forward. I hate to do this, but that's 5 days already. This will be day 6, 7, and 8. So we're already talking about next Tuesday. I just want to show you, so far, nothing getting into Florida here. The storm is in the Atlantic Ocean, although still making tremendous waves again and still a lot of potential. It was still a Cat 3 or Cat 4. So it is not going to, at least for now, follow the same track after it crosses the Dominican Republic. It should turn to the right. We'll watch it. I know 8 days out on a hurricane forecast is a guess. The range of error could be 500 miles one way or the other. I just wanted to push it forward so you can look at it, because otherwise, it's hard to look at on the computer, just so that we can visualize it for you, Allison.
Thank you very much, Chad. We will not hold you responsible 8 days out, but tomorrow we will start to. Thank you very much for that. So is the Trump administration preparing a new version of the travel ban? The president says he wants it to be tougher and more specific. One of the president's top supporters here on that and more next.
Any specifics at all? And really what I heard McMaster say was they're focused on security. They know that...
And Allison Camerata.
We want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. This is New Day. It is Monday, September 18th, 6 o'clock here in New York. Chris is off. John Berman joins me. Great to have you.
Nice to be here this Monday.
We'll be keeping an eye on those hurricanes, obviously. But here is our starting line. All eyes on President Trump at the United Nations as he prepares to address world leaders for the first time. The international community watching to see how the president will address his America First policy and his skepticism about the UN. North Korea's nuclear test will loom large over the annual gathering. U.S. officials warn the Pyongyang that time is running out for a peaceful solution. And U.S. bombers and fighter jets again today conducting drills over the Korean peninsula.
Well, that's going on. Some of Hollywood's biggest names got political last night at the Primetime Emmy Awards. Former White House press secretary Sean Spicer. He made a surprise appearance mocking President Trump's inauguration crowd-size claims, really his own crowd-size claims. Many sounded off on social media about this comedy bit. Not everyone liked it. We're also tracking 2 hurricanes, not 1 but 2, in the Atlantic. Hurricane Jose putting the Northeast on edge, while Hurricane Maria takes aim at Caribbean islands devastated by Irma just 1 week ago. We have this all covered for you. Let's begin with Michelle Kaczynski live at the United Nations with the big meetings that start today. Michelle.
Hi, John. Right. For this, President Trump's first address to the world before the UN General Assembly, leaders are wanting to see how he addresses them, what his tone will be, how he articulates foreign policy beyond what they've heard before, because they've heard the America First. They've seen all of the tweets, all of the calls for other countries to contribute more, as well as a number of mixed messages from this administration. Some key leaders, though, won't be here this time around, including Germany, Russia, and China. President Trump, now home in New York, but about to face the UN, a body he has sharply and repeatedly slammed.
The United Nations is not a friend of democracy. It's not a friend to freedom.
Where now he will also seek more cooperation to face the world's biggest problems. The president set the stage with a Sunday tweet storm, referring to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un as Rocket Man, and retweeting a video edited to show him knocking over former rival Hillary Clinton with a golf ball. Members of his administration out in front of cameras with more tough talk on the North Korean nuclear threat.
We don't have a lot of time left. If our diplomatic efforts fail, though, our military option will be the only one left.
Was the president's fire and fury remark an empty threat?
It was not an empty threat. I'm perfectly happy kicking this over to General Mattis because he has plenty of military option.
At the same time, though, the U.S. has been aggressively calling on China and Russia to do more to choke off Kim Jong-un's resources. Beijing and Moscow did vote in favor of unprecedented UN sanctions against North Korea, a step the president and his national security advisor have since downplayed, to the apparent chagrin of the State Department.
Are the sanctions a big deal or are they not a big deal? Because I've heard two really different things.
I think the sanctions, and I'm not going to go against the president, but I think the sanctions are significant.
Allies have been confused at times over what this administration values more, collaboration or going it alone. Trump's America First doctrine reflected in the three themes the president is expected to touch on in his speech Tuesday.
First is to protect the American people. The second is to promote American prosperity. And the third is really to help promote accountability and sovereignty.
The U.S. footprint at the UN this year, much smaller than it's been in the past. Meetings overall, fewer, leaving allies skeptical of how much the U.S. will be engaged on key agenda items like democracy promotion, refugees, and the environment. And how a nationalistic leader of the free world will embrace this global entity now.
I personally think he slaps the right people, he hugs the right people, and he comes out with U.S. being very strong in the end.
So we will first see the president this morning chairing a session on reforming the UN. As we know, he's been critical of the UN, saying that the U.S. bears too much of the cost burden. He'll also then later meet with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, French President Macron, and tonight a dinner with Latin American leaders. Allison?
Michelle, you're so right. He has been critical of the UN in the past, and we'll get to more of that momentarily. Thank you for all the reporting. Let's bring in our political panel. We have CNN political analysts John Avlon and David Drucker, and associate editor and columnist for Real Clear Politics, A.B. Stoddard. Everybody in the house this morning, which is great to have you all. I mean, he has been highly critical of the UN. Let me just remind people, in March of this year, what President Trump said about the UN, and that will set the table for what he's going to say this week. So listen to this.
The United Nations is not a friend of democracy. It's not a friend to freedom. It's not a friend even to the United States of America, where, as you know, it has its home. And it surely is not a friend to Israel.
Okay, that was the last year, John Berman. Thank you very much. So, John Avlon, now what? What will the tone be this week?
Well, it's obviously one thing if you're tweeting or ghostwriting books or speaking to AIPAC, as I believe that excerpt was from. It's another thing if you're actually the president of the United States with.
Hey, they're a cash crop.